morning, everyone. Welcome to the State Allocation Board Audit Subcommittee hearing, and welcome to our new subcommittee member, Assemblymember Buchanan. Welcome. And to our veteran members, Kathleen Moore and Esteban Almanza. A little background on November 3rd, really, of 2010, State Allocation Board adopted audit policies developed by this subcommittee. The board approved an implementation plan for those policies in December of 2010. In taking these actions in 2010, the board recognized the critical importance of accountability and transparency in the allocation of state bond dollars. At that time, the board directed staff to, 1, convene an audit committee that would review the audit guide for clarity, consistency, and transparency, and review the audit guide annually thereafter. I think we now call it the policy, the program guide, is that, or is it?
Yes.
The program guide. Determine an independent entity, I may say audit guide, but it's synonymous also with that. Determine an independent entity to conduct audits based upon the audit guide. Develop incremental compliance reviews and other related tasks detailed in the board action item. The audit subcommittee met this past April and received a report from the OPSC staff on the implementation of the board audit policies. We learned that many of the board policies had not been implemented by staff in the 18 months since board adoption. As a result, the subcommittee asked that the Audit Working Group reconvene to review and make recommendations to the Audit Subcommittee on the following issues. A, clarify whether it was the intent of the working group to recommend to the Audit Subcommittee that an independent entity conduct both the desk review and site visit components of the audit. B, does the OPSC statement that they, quotes, are not performing audits but are conducting desk reviews, does that change any of the recommendations the working group made to the Audit Subcommittee in 2010, and which was later adopted by the SAB in November of 2010? If so, what are these amended recommendations? And C, are these desk reviews adequate to ensure accountability for the use of state bond funds? Also, we asked the OPSC to return to the Audit Subcommittee in May with an analysis of the costs of conducting audits by an independent entity versus the costs of OPSC desk reviews, while also solving the issue of audit independence. The analysis should include current OPSC staffing levels and costs for audit and desk review services. And 3, ask the Assistant Executive Officer to request that a representative of the Controller's Office attend the next Audit Subcommittee to discuss auditing services. We're now going to hear a report from the staff on the recommendations of the Audit Working Group. Welcome. And first, before I begin, are there any of the members of the subcommittee that wish to make a statement? Is that fine? Please begin.
Yeah. Good morning. Lisa Silverman with the Office of Public School Construction.
Can we hear you, Lisa? Are you on? Pull the mic closer.
Yeah. So, yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to come back, and I know for the most part you did cover a lot of areas, and staff have been working diligently with the work group and to try to resolve and make some formal recommendations. I think the goal is to kind of blush out some of the concepts that were discussed at the work group and try to see whether or not we have enough support to either go back and channel those concepts and further refine or bring those forward to the State Allocation Board for an approval. So again, the goal is to try to work out some of these issues from a perspective of streamlining our processes, plus also establishing interim review so we can do additional compliance checks on the front end versus on the back end. With that, I know Mr. Savage has a few comments he wants to share.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Bill Savage, Assistant Executive Officer for the State Allocation Board. Senator Lowenthal gave a good background of the process leading up to our meeting today. Since the meeting in April, the Audit Working Group has met 3 times to look at a number of different options for increased accountability, for trying to flesh out the implementation of the original recommendations that were adopted by the board. And what we're bringing you today is a document. There's a flow chart that you have in your packets entitled Proposed Process for SFP Review and Audits. And this ties back to the original board recommendations and in 3 key areas: in the area of doing compliance checks for certifications earlier and consolidating that with a number of other milestones, proposing a process for external audits, and also maintaining OPSC's final expenditure review and then reconciliation to the State Allocation Board. And so we think that this meets the intent of the original working group recommendations that were forwarded and approved by the board. The reason that we're here today is primarily we want to make sure we're heading in the right direction. We want to get some feedback from the subcommittee. This is a new approach. It's a similar approach to what was adopted, but it really fleshes it out and proposes a model using an external audit function that already exists in the state for school districts. So we want to hear concerns from the subcommittee and any stakeholders and get direction from the subcommittee in terms of going forward. We think that there's probably a need to have a meeting or 2 of the working group after this, but it kind of depends upon what happens during today's meeting. And so I do want to say that it's been a pleasure to work with the working group there. The working group includes representatives from the State Controller's Office, from the California Department of Education, from FICMAT, from independent auditors, from county offices of education, from school districts. So we get a wide range of perspectives and a really good understanding of some of the needs of accountability in the state regarding our state bond funds. I also want to say that it's really been a pleasure to work with the Office of Public School Construction in this process. And during these 3 meetings, they've been fully engaged in helping to prepare the recommendations and working with members of the working group to really flesh out a proposal that I think has a lot of merit, and want to turn to Mr. Rick Asbell to give us a presentation on that process.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, subcommittee members. Next slide, please. For the audience, we are referencing a PowerPoint presentation, and after our meeting here, we'll get it posted up on the website, so not to confuse anybody here. So when we looked at the current process, I think there's 3 things that we kind of zeroed in on, and I think they've kind of already been touched upon initially. One of the things is we need to streamline the process. It takes too long right now to be able to close out projects. The current statutory and regulatory framework of the program allows for a project essentially to be closed out 6 or 7 or 8 years after the final fund release. So that's a big issue. We also understand certifications. They need to be checked a little bit earlier in the process. The majority of our material inaccuracies that we brought to the board in the past have been associated with the self-certifications, most notably the 5005. So we know that's an issue. That's something where we need to kind of look at things a little bit earlier in the process. Additional accountability. The compliance reviews that we're doing right now may not be have enough of the accountability elements in there for this particular program, so we know that's an issue also. So on the next slide, to address these concerns, as we were going through the process, the vetting process with Audit Work Group, we came up with a few recommendations. First of all, we want to be able to shorten the life cycle of a project. And the way things are right now, once a project submits 100% report, regulation states that we have 2 years as OPSC to commence the review of that particular project. We're actually advocating that 2 years through a regulatory change be reduced down to a 1-year wait period, essentially. The other issue that's popped up also is exploring a new trigger for the completion of a project. So currently 100% report is the trigger, but we have had instances where projects have come in and they've never met the 100% threshold. Districts will submit a 99% report. We never get to the 100% report. So we were looking at maybe another alternative to that. In terms of the verifications or the certifications, we want to be able to bring forward a compliance check, it's an incremental compliance check, would be at 18 months. And what that would do is that would consolidate looking at 5004 certifications, 5005 certifications, and then rolling into a check that we currently have at 18 months, which is called a substantial progress check. We believe that we can leverage what we already have in the system. That would be one check at 18 months as opposed to checks prior to that.
How do you define substantial progress?
The way the regulations are set up, you have to show that you're making quote unquote substantial progress toward the completion of your project. So there's a checklist of things that you have to obtain at that 18 months. If you don't attain those criteria, those milestones at 18 months, the projects could be rescinded.
Could you just give me, I mean, when you request funding, you're supposed to be under contract, so what exactly are we expecting to be done at 18 months?
An example.
I think one of them is, I may have to ask Julie on this one, but I think it's 75%?
Could you please come forward, identify yourself, and kind of respond to the Assembly member's question about just really what are those criteria that we use for substantial progress?
My name is Julie Ennis. Is it turned on?
Sorry, yeah.
That one up there.
The long one.
The long one.
Yeah.
Put it
Okay.
close to your
Sorry.
speaker.
Okay.
That's it.
So there's different criteria for design and site and adjusted grant phase. So for site, you have to meet all of the, I might not remember these off the top of my head, so, but for site, you have to meet all the criteria, and it's meeting CEQA requirements. You have to have the final appraisal of the site, I think final escrow docs, and I'm not remembering another one of them. And then for design, you only have to meet one of the criteria, and one is to submit your adjusted grant application, or the other one would be to submit a site application, and one is to have your plans. They don't have to be completely approved by DSA, but they have to be submitted to DSA for approval. And the other one would be, if you couldn't meet it within the 18 months, then you would get a 18-month extension that you would request from the State Allocation Board, and the district would have to submit a narrative of other evidence. And then for the adjusted grant, it's that one, it's 75% of, thanks, yes, at least 75% of the site development work is necessary prior to the building construction activity is complete, and then at least 90% of the building construction activities are under contract unless the building construction activities are delayed as a result of necessary site development work. And then the third one is all construction activities are at least 50% complete, and then also an adjusted grant phase. You can't get an extension, but they can submit something for other evidence also to show that they meet substantial progress, and then the board, we would send a narrative to the board, and the board would determine whether they were complete and have met progress on the project. So for site, you have to meet all of the checks, and then for the design and adjusted grant, you just have to check one of the boxes. And that's all in regulation. So, and I might finish the site one. So it was, I didn't say all of them. It was a final appraisal of the site, CEQA, obtained final approval from Department of Ed, and then final escrow. Like, I missed one of them.
Assembly member, one of the things that we looked at in the working group was there's really two basic milestones after fund release, one at 12 months, which is the current requirement to submit your first expenditure report, or 5006, and the other is at 18 months. So we wrestled in the committee, the working group, with whether we wanted to align them both. We wanted to streamline them so there was less work for both school districts and OPSC. So we said, well, what if we move the substantial progress requirement to 12 months rather than 18? And we didn't want to, we saw that there could be districts that would have a hard time meeting that, and so we didn't want to jam them, so to speak, by pushing that up. And so the audit working group is proposing that these be consolidated at 18 months, so the 12-month expenditure report would move to 18 months to be consolidated, and then that would go with the incremental certification check at that time, too.
So, refresh for me, when we do fund releases, how do we do those in terms of what percent or what we're doing?
You have to have 50% of the contract in place, plus a validation of whether or not you have a labor compliance program or a CMU before we can release the funds.
And are we releasing the full grant?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So just to
So-
follow up, just to understand,
That's right.
so we, with 50% under contract, we release. And instead of having a 12-month and an 18-month, your recommendation is to do it all at 18 months to move the 12-month to the 18-month. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Assembly member.
So, we have a fund release request. They have to show us that technically they'll have a LCP and that they're 50% under contract, and we release the full grant amount, but then 18 months later, all we expect is either 75% of the site development work to be done, or, I mean,
For many districts, I think for many districts that's not a high bar, and I think that, but there certainly are projects and districts or entities, county offices that would have difficult projects, and so we're trying to respect that. But so we wrestled with this notion of which of these milestones to try and consolidate around, but interested in your feedback on it.
Yeah, I guess where I'm going, and I agree that there's got to be some flexibility, but if you're releasing the full grant amount, I would hope that after 18 months, we would be defining substantial progress in a way that most projects, we built a high school for 2,400 students in less than 2 years' time. So I'm not saying every district can do that, but it seems to me we've got two problems. One is, how do we make sure these projects are being completed as quickly as possible? And then the second is, how are we going to interact in terms of audits and checkpoints? And, what really bothers me is the 99% versus 100%. I mean, it seems to me like we want to give the money, we want to get the project done, and there's got to be some reasonable time to have 100%, so we don't end up, we had a situation earlier this year where we approved a good project, solar, but, the buildings have been occupied for how many years was it? 4 or 6 years, but we weren't considering it complete because the audit hadn't been complete. So we've got to have some way, I think, of tightening these definitions and making sure that we're actually getting to construction and completion as soon as possible.
Length, a new trigger for completion or a recognition of completion. And right now, Education Code allows school districts to occupy schools without final certification and closeout, and that's a whole other issue that relates to DSA closeout and certification.
Unless it's new construction, in which case we don't fund.
Well, no, that's a different issue, but
that's
yeah.
Right, I know.
But I think one of the things that we talked about was, is there a trigger related to occupancy that would initiate the closeout of the process? And really, this is a bigger issue, I think, than audits, but one possible trigger that we discussed was to have a certificate of occupancy, if you will. So at the point at which you occupy the project, that begins your X period beyond that, so whether it's 6 months or a year, then you're automatically considered to be complete by OPSC, and then the final review starts.
So what do you do when a district has to open a school because you have an opening date set, and because I've been here and you probably have been there too, where you say, look, we'd like you to make sure the classrooms are done. We can live without the multi-use room or the gym being finished for a few months, but we've got to have,
Well, I wasn't meaning
to
to mix up the question of certification with occupancy, but to suggest that when districts occupy a building, that might be let's say the project is occupied, that might be something that triggers X number of months beyond that, then you're considered 100% complete
Okay.
for
So it would be-
OPSC audit. I don't want to get into the certification issue particularly, but they're
Right.
connected somewhat.
Yeah, you've got to somehow be able to make some kind of adjustment there.
Kathleen?
So you're asking for feedback on each of these stages, I'm assuming. And the verify certifications earlier in the life cycle of a project, actually, the recommendation, as I understand it, is coming back to verify later in the project. We're going to 18 months instead of 12.
No, the certifications are, well, and Mr. Asbell can help me out too whenever I misspeak. So the certifications now are checked at the closeout phase of the project. So we're proposing to move the certification check to an earlier incremental compliance point at the beginning or at 18 months into the project, rather than potentially 4 to 6 years down the road.
And we had originally a year on that. Is that correct?
That was
Or
correct.
consolidating the two, because I will say, I thought that one of the problems we were trying to overcome was that there is a compounding if there's a mistake made. So if someone didn't have their correct certification and didn't know, it's 18 months in that they may be penalized for some reason around that. So I'm wondering if there's a way to check the certification actually at the point that it's submitted or close to thereof, so that we're correcting for if there's any problem early in the project.
So I think one of the things, and when we get to the next slide, when we look at the big graphical display, we do kind of have a bifurcation of looking at some of the certifications, namely the 5005, and it's actually going to be at the fund release.
Okay.
So it's way in advance of the 18 months.
Before we leave this question of 18 months versus 12 months, though, would the subcommittee prefer that we focused on 12 months rather than 18? I mean, we're talking about a need, if we do, either one of them, to adjust some regulatory language to make this consolidated checklist work. There's probably some good arguments for 12 and good arguments for 18.
I thought you mentioned that while for most districts, many, the 12 months could be appropriate, but then you have some of the county offices of education and the more complex projects that it would be more difficult to do that. And so the compromise was to move it to 18 months. And then I think Assembly Member Buchanan said, is that process robust enough that we are really collecting the appropriate data at that moment? Okay. And that's the issue, is both the time and the robustness of that. And she had some questions about exactly what we're doing.
Yeah, and my other, I don't know if this is the best time or later, but we talked about it briefly in my office. I've talked, we have these, and it's brought down, I think, on this page or another page, these Prop 39 audits. When you see the material inaccuracies that come before us, they're because we weren't under contract, or we didn't have a labor compliance program. And when you look at them, if you have a Prop 39 bond, and I know that doesn't cover everybody, it doesn't cover county offices of education, but legally you have to do a financial audit annually and a performance audit annually. Except, as all of you know, there are no guidelines for the performance audit, so sort of the accountants got together and with some districts and said, okay, we're going to do some sampling and make sure that the money spent was on the purposes listed in the bond. But I still don't understand why we can't use that resource to be able to include these measures in their audit. So instead of, if the audit takes place at 18 months and then it may take a few months to check and get back to a district, and the district's been out of compliance, it seems to me that we're going to enter into the problem we have right now with an issue that's coming to us in the next board meeting in terms of when the LCP was in place. It seems to me you can have, I don't know why we can't have a Prop 39 audit help us with this and do some of those jobs. They're paying for it. So why can't we have them check? And, of course, the audit report would be sent to us, but then a district would know much, much earlier, within the first 12 months, whether or not they were meeting these types of performance requirements.
I know for some of the certifications we're talking about the material inaccuracy, and I know we've gone down this path, but we've actually instituted something sooner. About 3 or 4 years ago, we had a flood of material inaccuracies that the board were having monthly discussions about this issue, so actually probably 4 or 5 years ago. And the goal was to try to curb that and check the certifications up front. So that's why we had contracts in place. That's why we checked that they have a labor compliance program. So we actually, you saw a slide, we haven't even really seen additional material inaccuracies come forward because we cured that, that issue by having the cert up front. But I think as far as some of the other issues, I think, again, the goal is to try to marry the certifications. And if you check the certifications up front when the applications come in, there's 64 certifications that a district certifies to. That's quite...
Right, but what % of the actual projects do we audit?
About 6%.
6%.
Right.
So it seems to me that using these Prop 39 audits as a tool would be helpful for the districts and also would be helpful for us to focus our resources in the most efficient manner possible.
What I would, we wrestled with this issue of the Prop 39 audits as the external audit vehicle at length in our working group meetings. Why don't I have Mr. Asbell go ahead and finish the presentation and walk through the flow chart, no, if that's okay, and then we can come back to that because we certainly wrestled with that issue.
One last question, though, before we begin. Mr. Almanza.
Go ahead and finish.
Okay. That's the one question.
Okay, so now the third issue, we want to make sure, actually go back to the previous slide, increased accountability. So we've already kind of laid out the fact that maybe there needs to be an external function. We looked at that. One of the things that kind of came out of the audit work group, and we'll get into the flow chart here in a second, is the 5006 reports. Once those are submitted to OPSC, that would trigger an external function to take a look at those 5006 reports and potentially look at some internal controls also. Any additional scope above and beyond that would have to be probably put into some kind of audit guide or some kind of regulation structure. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go kind of into the graphical display. We've kind of thrown out a few concepts, but I want to try to bring it all together into this, this chart. A lot of things going on in this chart. There are essentially 4 parts to this. The green part where it says incremental compliance and substantial progress checks, that's OPSC, that's up until about 18 months. The middle section, the SAB expenditure review guide, which is in blue, that's the closeout process. And then we have an adjudicating authority, which is under yellow. But then we have a parallel track down here at the bottom, which would be the external function. So I'll get into how all this kind of ties together. So if we go from left to right, first thing that happens is we get a 5004 submittal. District comes in and they request a fund release. At that point, before the funds are released, we've implemented administratively at OPSC. We check construction contracts and LCP requirements at that point. We want to make sure we don't have any false 5005 issues coming out of that. The next box over would be your incremental compliance check, and this is using the 18-month time frame. Now, this would be a departure from current process in the fact that the first 5006 report would be due at 18 months as opposed to 12 months. So that would require regulatory and statutory change. The verifications that would occur at this point would be 5004 and 5005 certifications. Now, we'll get into another document later on that talks about certain things that can be checked. Not every 5004 or 5005 certification can be checked at the time of submittal. Some things have to be checked later on just because of the language and so forth associated with that certification. Under this proposal also, the first 5006 would trigger an external audit. And so you see the dashed line going down to the pink area. That's where you would have the scope, looking at internal controls, looking at expenditures on a 5006, and whatever else that needs to be kind of thrown in there. That would be looked at the external entity. The other thing I want to kind of point out too is you'll see circles with numbers in them, and that goes to another chart also that talks about the statutory and regulatory changes that would have to be done in order to make this work.
So the proposal for the external audit is in keeping with the notion that you raised, Assemblymember, about the Prop 39 audits. The proposal is that these would be an added scope that would be put into a district's education audit on an annual basis. The education audit guide is updated yearly through regulation, through the Department of Finance, through California Department of Ed and the State Controller's Office. School facilities program scope would be added to that. So a district would, as part of that education audit, there'd be X number of questions, a certain number of expenditures would be sampled. Obviously, a district that submits an expenditure report with 100 expenditures, they're not going to be audited on every expenditure. So auditors would use their standard risk model to sample expenditures and look at the things that Mr. Asbell mentioned, such as internal controls, compliance with regulation related to the expenditure of the funds, and were the expenditures fairly stated. So on an ongoing basis, when a district has an active project, each year there'd be a subset of questions in their external audit. Their audit that their district pays for now would include those funds. And then some of the questions related to that are the cost of that, how that gets carried, whether, so you could potentially trying to not impact the general fund, for example. So those SFP scope elements could be paid for from local bonds or potentially from state bond funds. These are some of the things that we're looking at, trying not to impact general fund expenditures. But the proposal is to try and use an existing structure that is in place now and that districts are used to as a way to provide an external audit function for SFP projects.
So, and that being their education audit?
Yes.
And can you just explain, just in background, and then Assemblymember Buchanan, what takes place in that education audit?
Well, currently the education audit looks at all of the district's expenditures related to the general fund and their compliance with all of the categorical funds and expenditures related to anything such, I mean, it goes as deeply as
You're talking
PTA.
about the standard annual audit.
Standard annual audit. So did the PTA collect the money and get it through the right channels? Did the cafeteria fund have the correct controls in place to get the milk money back to the district, to all of the types of audits, the correct number of teachers, staffing levels, et cetera. And so SFP scope added would be in keeping with that and just a part of that basic audit.
So I can see why you'd want to include this for like a county office of education, but you certainly don't want districts to have to include this in their annual audit and at the same time pay for a Prop 39 audit, which is both a financial audit and a performance audit, would you?
Well, I mean, I think the reason that the committee, the working group, was more focused on this audit path, I think there's two from my perspective. First one is, again, we don't have a lot. Some areas of the state don't have Prop 39 bonds. There's school districts that don't have them. So that's one. So we'd have to end up with a parallel track of some kind if we were going to do this. Secondly, I think that there's concern still in the audit community relating to the quality and the scope determination in the Prop 39 audits. And so I think the scope and quality have certainly gotten better over the last 10 years as there's been additional legislation in place. And I think the Prop 39 audits could work as a vehicle. So, and I went into this thinking that, but I'm persuaded by the fact that the education audits would provide a single vehicle for every entity that you could add the scope onto.
Well, legally, to be in compliance with Prop 39, if a district's incurred this extra cost in their education audit, they would still have to pay for a Prop 39 audit, correct?
That's correct.
So if you're talking about streamlining it from the district's point of view, you've just duplicated the effort, right?
Okay.
So,
point taken.
So I don't understand why. I mean, the problem with Prop 39 audits and the financial audits, my experience is the auditors know how to do financial audits, but I don't know. But the problem is we've never defined the performance audits. So it seems to me that one way to solve that because probably, I don't know what percent, but I would think 90% or more of our projects are Prop 39 projects. So for all those districts who are doing it, wouldn't one way be to develop an audit manual for both the financial and the performance audits, for districts that have the Prop 39 bonds and have to pay for it, and then, have an approved list of auditors, just like you have for the education audit, so they're not doing it twice, once for the education and once for Prop 39?
Okay, good.
I mean,
that's why we're here.
So this, I just want to hear, we're now dealing with, and I think the Assembly members raised, an alternative approach, the Prop 39 audit versus the education audit. I'd just like to hear some more, whether this was discussed in the working group and how you dealt with this issue in the working group, because the Assembly members raised the issue that this may be more appropriate for 90% of those districts. I'd like to hear, I don't have an opinion, I want to understand how this was discussed and what came out.
Good morning. My name is Andrea Sullivan, and I'm representing the Facilities Subcommittee of County Offices, and I'm on the working group. And this was an area that we discussed at length, and I think the working group's general direction was to provide consistency and accountability in the reviews that are being completed. And we felt that there were, among the Prop 39 audits, the districts are defining the scope of those audits, and so they can vary significantly. And so the external auditors actually had commented specifically that they felt that that wasn't the appropriate area. The annual audit is something that all districts and county offices participate in on an annual basis, and the cost to do that is expected to be nominal. And the amount of time that will be saved by staff, both at the districts, counties, and at OPSC for doing those reviews would offset any of those additional costs. And so to go with one audit that is consistent among the participating districts versus a Prop 39 that not everybody will have, and they will vary greatly, seem to be the most consistent approach that was recommended.
But you're from a county office of education, so I can certainly see why for the county office you don't have Prop 39 bonds and you would default to the education audit. But for a school district, when these auditors come in and take up all of this time, why should the facilities department have to spend all this time with the people who do your standard, I hate to call it an education audit, but your standard financial audit, and then, a few months later have to sit down and spend time with the auditors you're hiring for a Prop 39 audit, when if you had an audit manual and you had certification for these auditors, you would clarify the standards. It would be one standard for all your Prop 39 audits, and you wouldn't be tying up facilities time twice.
Well, we already are tying up facilities times twice because we're doing the OPSC reviews currently. And so having those consolidated into the annual audit was the direction that the group felt was.
I think there are two issues, though. One is the audit, and the second is what's included in the audit. And I know I'm not trying to belabor the point, but by law, every district that does a Prop 39 bond has to have a financial audit and a performance audit. If they're not clearly defined, we should have an audit manual, and people should be, districts would have to choose from that, approved list. But I still don't know why you're going to ask districts to go through that twice.
I think that the issue of the audit guide and the certification for the auditors related to Prop 39 is probably, those already exist for the education audit.
Right.
And so if we were to go down the Prop 39 route, we would have to develop a really more rigorous structure, probably with legislation to incorporate, and I think if we were trying to be consistent with the original recommendations that the board adopted about audits, we'd want to have an annual audit guide process that would include the input from the SFP so that they were consolidated in the Prop 39 audits. As you know, I went into this thinking that the Prop 39 audits would be a really good vehicle because in the district I was in, they were very rigorous. And I thought they were extremely effective, actually, too. But my sense is, from involvement with some statewide agencies or statewide entities and hearing a lot of feedback, they're not always as rigorous as that everywhere across the state. And so if we're going to go down that route, there's some work for us to do related to getting them to the level that the education audits are at now with a guide and a process.
And I guess my question is, shouldn't we do that? Wouldn't that be better for the taxpayers to know that you've got that consistency in a Prop 39 audit, and it certainly would clarify it for districts, and you wouldn't then have to...
So what you're saying is, instead of having, and this is an interesting argument that we need to do, instead of having a duplicative process, and if there are inconsistencies now between what certain districts do and others do in terms of what they're, what is in the requirements for a Prop 39. If we did do for those 90% of the districts that must do Prop 39, that we would need either statutorily or through regulations to create this consistency in the Prop 39 audits and to go in that direction. Yeah. So that is one approach.
That was exactly what I was going to comment on, because we do have a legislated process for the annual audit that meets annually with a prescribed group of people that determines what's in the audit guide and what will be audited annually, and any changes in that are approved through that process, and it's prescribed in legislation or in law, and because the Department of Education is a part of that, obviously, a part of that process.
So what you're saying also, again, it's clearer what we have to do there, and if we did decide to do the Prop 39, we would have to clarify that much.
Yeah, one of my questions is this. I heard earlier in the conversation that we currently audit in the manner that we do now through the Office of Public Schools Construction about 6% of projects. So are we recommending through this procedure, I mean, whether it's the Prop 39 or the annual audit, the recommendation that's coming forward, then are we at a 100% audit situation, or I mean, that hasn't...
That's basically the proposal, that any district that receives funds under the school facilities program would, at the 18-month milestone when they submit an expenditure report of 5006, that would trigger their participation in an audit, which would be a sample, a type audit. It's not that everything, it would follow standard procedures. It's not like you're not going to have every single expense audited. You do what auditors do in terms of assessing risk and sampling projects, and you develop a guide to check the projects for compliance with law and whether they were allowable or not allowable expenditures. And then each year you have funds available from the SFP. You go through that. And then the part that Rick hasn't gotten to yet is that at the end of the project, OPSC still has a function related to reconciliation. Many of the projects have money on the table, if you will, that need to be adjusted one way or the other. There's a reconciliation process that the Office of Public School Construction does that then goes back to the State Allocation Board for the approval of the reconciled funds, and also some projects that have no reconciliation that are just closed out at their final expenditure review, at which point OPSC honors the work of whatever audit function has already, in other words, they're not going to recheck every expenditure, but they're going to look at the final report, make any reconciliations and adjustments required, take those to the board, or issue a closeout letter for many districts with no reconciliation.
Mr. Amatza.
I think it's important to define, the difference between this Prop 39 audit and the reviews that OPSC does. I think what OPSC does is a review for payments and certification of on that 6%. I think what we do is certify the documentation behind the expenditures. Now, the Prop 39, I think, is a true audit, where auditors come on site, camp out for a while, and pull files, review everything. OPSC has never done that. Well, I think you tried to do that a few years ago, and that's what triggered this work group and this subcommittee. I do think that, given that it's a multi-billion-dollar local assistance program, we ought to have an audit program, a real audit program, which we've never had. So if we started to do this Prop 39, it would enhance what we currently do. Most of what we do, we have to do in managing the program. So a Prop 39 vehicle to do independent audits would would be good, but I don't think it's replaced anything that we're doing right now, because right now we don't do any on-site rigorous auditing.
See, I think we're in agreement. We can't, I mean, if we're doing 6%, we can't go from, I mean, you'd have to have 20 times more people to do 100%.
Right, we're not going to go there.
And I don't think we can go there financially. I think the whole idea of narrowing the time frame is good, because districts don't want that big surprise down the road 5 or 6 years after they spent all the bond money. Now you're saying, well, you owe us, money. I mean, the only place they can take that money is out of the general fund. So you've got to have a process that does a much better job of informing, and I think we have to have a process that requires better closeouts on the district's part so they don't drag on as well. So the thinking behind my recommending that we use Prop 39 in a more robust way is that if we had those audits and the results were sent, they would provide earlier triggers for the district, but they also would provide reports to our staff and hopefully help us narrow where we want to focus our time. We all know if you want to read an audit report, you read it from the back to the front. You go to the exceptions first, and that tells you where there are problems. So it seems to me that would help us, take a look at these things. And if the auditors have to be approved and you have a real audit guide, then you've improved the process dramatically.
That was one of, excuse me, Senator. That was one of my questions as well, is if we go down this path and ask to, have more information. I think this is an intermediary time check-in. Is that question of if there is an audit exception, whether it be in the Prop 39 or in the education audit or whatever direction that we kind of determine to go, how is that handled? Currently, that audit exceptions in the education audit are handled at the school district, and then ultimately can be handled at the state controller level. So how do we, or the state controller, state auditor, how I think we would want to explore that as well. Currently, the Office of Public School Construction, any concerns or issues that are raised in their functions are dealt with by the state allocation board or the office. So how would we propose, when you're looking at this and coming back to us, how would we propose to handle that issue?
Actually, that's kind of a part of the flow chart. So maybe we can continue on with that, and then I can kind of explain that. So going to the next box over to the right, in the middle under the SAP expenditure review, the first blue box. So after the first 5006 report comes in, then you're required to submit on an annual basis additional expenditure reports. And then once again, we have another dash line that's going down to the pink box down there. The next box over, we talk about the trigger for the completion of a project. Once that comes in, and that gets added to our workload list, and kind of what I alluded to before, we're proposing a regulation change from 2 years down to 1 year on how long it sits on our workload list before we engage and do some kind of a review. The next box over is when we actually begin the review, and that's based off of the final 5006. Kind of dovetailing on what Bill was saying, we are not going to duplicate what the external function had done previously, i.e. looking at previous 5006 reports. We would look at the final expenditure report and do our reconciliation based off of that. One of the other things at this point, too, there might have been some 5004 and 5005 certifications we were not able to check earlier on in the process, maybe because the information wasn't available to the district or us, that we would check at this point also. And then once from there, then we would do our review, and then based on the outcome of that review, either the district would agree or disagree, and then it would go to the state allocation board for final adjudication. Going back down to the parallel track, though, if there is a finding, we talked about this at length at the audit work group. One of the things that we threw out, and I think we're still trying to blush out some of these concepts, is the trigger related to a finding in which repayment of funds are due. I have a dash line at the very bottom right now that goes from a decision point that goes up to the blue part that's dashed. that if a reconciliation would have to occur because of a financial finding, it would have to go back to the State Allocation Board. That's the current structure right now. Anything that has an adjustment up or down has to go to the State Allocation Board. So that is a possibility to look at there. Or the other process is they would just continue down the Education Audit Appeals Panel process, and the finding would be adjudicated that way. So that's kind of a parallel track, but then it kind of diverges based on what kind of finding that you're looking at. And I think that was what we just talked about.
So does that answer your question, Ms. Moore?
Somewhat, yes.
Okay.
Somewhat, yes. Not.
So it basically, if there's a finding that apparently would result in the return of funds, that's something that would need to go back to the State Allocation Board, because that's the agency that does all the allocations and adjustments, reconciliations. If there are findings in an audit that don't necessarily involve money, they could go through the regular process for whatever audit it is we're using, and be many times in audits, districts receive findings or comments or various items from their auditors, and many of them are resolved internally and responded to by districts as they go forward. Some of them require changes in process, et cetera. So there's certainly a line of actions that come out of audit findings and exceptions that districts are pretty used to, at least in the education audit side.
Mr. Savage, if you've been through a Prop 39 audit as a school district, then how does the district deal with any exceptions currently in a Prop 39 audit?
Well, we never had any major exceptions at our district, and I think it's really good to go back and remember what Prop 39 audits are meant to do. And the primary function of a Prop 39 audit is to ensure that the funds are being spent in accordance with the bond language on the projects that the district listed. And so there's a pretty fundamental focus of them. That's on the financial side, it's checking the transactions related to that. Were those on projects that were on the project list that the Board of Education approved? The performance audit side is, if we're talking about a vehicle to use, it's probably the better approach for this program, potentially, because the performance audit is casts a little bit broader net and looks at the entire structure of the district that is expending bond funds, ensuring that their processes are there related to the projects that are on the bond list, but also looking at compliance with law, bidding and procurement processes, and et cetera. So typically, the findings that we got, or the exceptions or issues that arose in the audits that we had to deal with, we would propose a solution to that, and then the auditors would come back and accept that or not. You know, if we had 3 projects that should have been bid in a certain way, then we would say, well, we'll do them this way. Here's the structure we've set up to respond to that, and they would say, yes, that's fine. So a little bit different structure than in the education audit.
So if we were to use the Prop 39 vehicle to establish an external audit program that we currently don't have, wouldn't the auditor's report come back to staff, and any significant findings be brought before the State Allocation Board?
I think that what we were talking about with Mr. Asbell's review is that especially areas where there was a need for funds where it might need to be returned, or the funds were impacted, definitely. I don't think we've talked at length about the process of the feedback process to the board in terms of any of the external audits, whether it's the education audit or Prop 39. We did talk in the working group a little bit about how audits are posted or the information available in the audits, and there were some recommendations in the original work about that. But I think this is one of the areas that needs to get fleshed out is how does information get back to the board? What is the posting and public accountability pieces? Right now, the education audit is posted on the school district's website, and I think one of the current pieces of legislation that I think Senator Weiland carried for Prop 39 performance audits was to require those to be sent to the state controller's office. So there's certainly a lot of activity in the field relating to wanting to get the information back up to the state level.
Yes, because the monies that are delivered by the State Allocation Board and OPSC, they're our responsibility. We're the ones held accountable. The staff OPSC is held accountable financially for the program. So if we're going to have this new external audit conducted through the Prop 39 vehicle, then for the record and for accountability, then that audit and its findings need to be a part of our file.
Yep. I think we agree that that they definitely need to get transmitted in some way back to OPSC because it becomes part of the overall project file.
So as I understand, where we are. Well, I have one question. I'm going to make a kind of a comment and ask someone threw out that 90% would be covered under Prop 39. How did you arrive at that number? Is that a real number or just an estimate?
I think some of the information that we have.
I'm just wondering where that
came. It might be more than 90.
Well, I just don't know what that number is. I'm just wondering how we would know.
I think actually CDE has a listing. One of the ways we can tell is there's a table and listing of bonds that have been passed locally since 1998, and the percentage that are Prop 39 bonds and the percentage that are non-Prop 39 bonds, and it's in that neighborhood, 80, 90%, I believe. Ms. Moore, you have that.
We have the list. I don't have it by percentage of districts that participate. We have it on percentage of pass rate. But I would assume that those that are not a part of the Prop 39 audit area are hardship and county offices, and those would be the two. And then the other, there's a lot of coordination that would have to go on because these Prop 39 committees exist during the time of the bond fund expenditures, which may or may not coincide with the completion of a project. So I think we'd have to look at that carefully.
Citizens Oversight Committees.
Right, the Citizens Oversight Committees. I know that and the Citizens Oversight Committees, they have the committee members have prescribed membership time allotments. I don't, and we just extended that by legislation.
Correct, 3 2-year terms.
3 2-year terms. Mm-hmm. So that's a 6-year function potentially on it, and that I would think we'd want to look at how is it consolidated if there's more than one Prop 30. I'm assuming more than one Prop 39 bond issuance, which could happen. There could be different times that a community has gone or school district has gone to their voters for bond authorization, so that would have to be considered as well. Any other, Andrea, that you know?
I just had a thought as far as, if we're looking to have some consistency in the scope for the Prop 39, that what's included in the education audit for facilities review, that component would establish a baseline of what needs to be in the Prop 39 audit. So rather than trying to adjust all the Prop 39 audits to fit this, you establish what that criteria is as part of the education audit, and it gets carried into the Prop 39, and maybe that reduces the scope of the Prop 39 and has some more consistency between all Prop 39 audits.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that this is, from the committee, it's still not resolved. It's an open issue, and that I think we've raised a lot of interesting issues that have been, and my sense is that the Audit Working Group, and I'm going to listen to also the public comment that comes out, needs to go back and struggle with this issue and to come back to us with it. That we could go either way depending upon what is the most appropriate information that we get. Really, it's all about which provides us with the most appropriate information. And if it means that as you pointed out, that we go with the Prop 39, but we need to make that more robust also, and to deal, that's fine too. We just need you to struggle with that issue and then come back to us.
I hear.
And I have a question on this section of the flow chart, because there's a distinction that we hadn't discussed at the Audit Working Group that notes that the additional 5006 reports would be verified through the external audit, except the final 5006. And that was not something that we had discussed with the working group. And so I think that that's something that definitely needs to go back, because what this is showing is that that would now be picked up by OPSC. And our understanding at the Audit Working Group would be that that would just be actually, that would still be part of the audit by the external auditor, but the reconciliation would be OPSC's review, but not auditing the expenditures. So I want to make sure that we're clear on that.
Good. In going forward, too, if I think a good way for us to wrestle with this, if it's okay with this subcommittee, I'd actually like to propose that we maybe bring an additional resource to the Audit Working Group and ask someone involved in Prop 39 audits to sit on the panel with us, if that's okay with the subcommittee.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think we need to make the most rational decision, and if that's going to help us, then that would be certainly appropriate.
Are you suggesting Cowbell?
No, I'm not. I don't have a suggestion right at this time, but I'll get back to you.
Right.
And we'll let you know.
Let's go to the next slide. So the next slide here, we had talked about when certifications would be looked at, and so we put together a matrix based on the certifications on the 5004, the 5005, and substantial progress. We've got them broken out into when we would check these, when would be at the time of fund release, and that really relates to the 5005 with the contracts and the LCP requirements. And then in the middle column, you've got the consolidated check, which would be the 5004, the 5005, and substantial progress check, which would take care of a majority of those certifications. And then the final column would be the SFP closeout. I talked about earlier about some of these certifications we would not be able to check until later on. As an example, if you go down to line 27, under the 5004 certification, fire system requested funding is installed during project before completion. We could check that at the incremental review, but the project may not be close to complete, so that's why we have an X there at the SFP closeout stage. So, in theory, it would be nice to be able to check all these certifications at the time of submittal, but reality is we wouldn't be able to check a lot of these just because they wouldn't be ready by then. So that's what this chart is showing here. And you can tell that there's a lot of certifications on here. If you combine all three of the documents together, I think you're looking at 67 certification-related line items. But this at least would give a sense and a heads up to the districts of what we would be checking and when we would be checking them.
Rick, so the column in the middle, the consolidated incremental compliance check, that's the 18-month check?
Yeah, that's correct, yes.
And that's all the things that would be checked, that would be reviewed during that time?
Right.
I think the better word is could be reviewed at that time. And I think that auditors work by, I've learned a lot about working with auditors since I've been involved in this process. And I think that auditors work by sampling techniques because the amount of data and the amount of information is so overwhelming. So they focus on areas of risk and look at a specific subsets of items, but this is a listing of items that could be. These are certifications that are made by districts.
But
some of them are clearly more important than others.
Public school construction work, right, versus external auditor work.
Yes, correct.
Since we all, being lay people, are not really quite sure and assume that all of this is done in every audit, which is you're saying is could be done, might be done. Are there those that are more that we need to kind of examine that are more appropriate that should be done, and others are choices? I just need to understand that.
Kind of going back to our flow chart, the biggest issues that we've seen with material inaccuracies are making sure you have contracts in place at the time of the 5005. So we're checking every single one of those for every single one of the projects.
Okay.
That's a hot button issue. LCP has been a hot button issue, so we're checking the labor compliance. Those, without fail, are going to be checked on every single project.
Okay.
You have assurances on that. Other ones, you know, it is kind of a hot, whatever the hot button issue is at the time, if we start to see that there's an issue that's popping up with a certain certification, then what we may do is focus toward looking at those for maybe all the projects, because we know we have a problem there.
And that will be really clearly spelled out in the audit guide or the guide, because really what we're trying to do is to make sure that everybody knows what the rules are and that they're following the rules. And there has to be consistency between what we ask people to do and then what we audit. And so I just want to make sure that, you know, that was one of the driving reasons for the audit.
I think one of the things you need to keep in mind, though, it's very fluid and dynamic, because at one point we may not be having an issue, and all of a sudden now we start to see these issues pop up. So, I mean, we will do the best we can as far as outreach, notifying districts on what we will look at, because to have a crystal ball to understand what certifications are going to be issues down the road is very, very difficult.
Right. As I say, you know, we don't want to go through a process where we get into an adversarial relationship where it's a gotcha. You know, we're trying to make sure that we maintain the highest standards, that we check for that, and yet it's clearly defined as much as possible.
And I think the goal is, once we put the cert check in place, I mean, is to also flesh out what other documents may be required as far as validating that checklist.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, but once we get through this and get married to it, then we can create what that checklist would look like. So that way it's a clear table, clear standard for everyone to understand.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm looking at the certification list that you're making. I mean, and I don't know exactly on some of these, but district has considered joint use of land and facilities. I mean, it's, you know, the DVBE or whatever. It's. I mean, I look at some of these things, and a lot of it looks to me like it would be a very simple. I don't want to keep belaboring the Prop 39, but a very simple checklist for someone to say, yes, here's a copy of the district's resolution or whatever, because I just get back to the sooner the district knows of a problem, the easier it is to correct it. And, you know, if you're not a couple years down the road finding this out and then finding out you're potentially jeopardizing the funding you've received, it's better.
Okay. Next slide.
Okay.
Okay, so going back to our multicolored flow chart, we've got numbers that are in circles, and the chart that we have here on the wall now kind of speaks to what we think would have to be done from a regulatory and statutory change in order to make this proposal work. So one of the things that we would look at, just looking at the very first one, if we were to do an 18-month incremental check, there'd have to be a change to the statute and regulation. Also changing the reporting requirement at 18 months as opposed to 12 months. We're looking at statutory and regulatory change. The trigger, that would be in regulation. In statute, it doesn't say, it talks about a final report being due. So we may have to make a statute change on that, but we weren't sure on that. The review of the final expenditure report, that would require a regulation change. That would be on our workload list, changing it from 2 years to 1 year. And then as far as the annual audit guide and the findings and how they're handled, I think that really needs to be blushed out. We need to talk to maybe state controllers, education audit appeal panel, maybe talk to Prop 39 personnel and see how we can kind of make that happen if that's the way we want to go.
Yeah, and I think if we were to go down the road of a Prop 39 audit as opposed to an education audit that was the basis of this chart, there's probably a different matrix we could bring you regarding which elements of the education code and or regulations need to be adjusted for those components.
I know I'm done. Two questions. Again, I'm not trying to supersede OPSC's responsibility. Just the question in my mind is what is the most efficient? And then my last question that I don't think we sort of touched on the beginning, the 99% versus 100% complete. But, you know, what is the time frame there where a district has to be 100% complete? So can close it out, and there is some certainty there for the district. So, if I file my income taxes, I know that if they haven't been reviewed within the first 4 years, unless there's fraud or something else, I'm sort of home free. It seems to me that we ought to more closely define when these projects have to be 100% complete. You don't drag out the 99% for years. And then, we're providing within this some certainty that says, okay, if you're not the among the 6% or whatever, I mean, we're doing this, that the districts have certainty so we don't have the Compton situation or other types of situations that come out years down the road.
So we'll take that back to the audit working group.
If I could just comment on that briefly, I did want to just note that although there are projects that come in for several years at 99%, it's due to different reasons. One could be that you're waiting for your final change order to be approved by DSA. We've had to wait a year before for that. I think that's being streamlined at this point, but generally, you don't want to close out your project after you've been in the facility a couple of months. You want a whole year to make sure that you've purchased all the appropriate furniture and equipment and that you haven't missed something. And especially at the high school level, that's really critical. So it's not just a we're just putting it off. There are actual, things that are being considered and taken into account that you wouldn't be able to turn that in following immediately of the notice of completion.
If you have a change order at DSA, I have no problem with that, But if you've given the contractor final payment, is the 10% retention, then is that 100%? I mean, so
I think
what's
what's indicating is that there are some things that come at the end of the project, particularly a lot of the equipping and furnishing that oftentimes are what go on for a period of time. But I think you could arrive at a period of time that everybody agrees to. It's not current, right? Do we have one, Lisa, that you have to file the 100% within?
No, I mean, the parameters is either you report 3 to 4 years after once you receive your fund release, your project should be complete within a 3 to 4 year window. But we have challenges when we don't necessarily have the full reporting of the project, because folks may say, I'm only 99% complete, but yet may extend that chain of that real trigger, because it's either or. So if they don't report 100% complete, that string keeps getting extended. So we don't necessarily get to shorten that window if that string keeps getting extended. So we all agree that a trigger date would be really helpful for us. One of those aspects is, do you create a bright line test with that trigger mark? Is it occupied plus 6 months, or do you have projects that have encumbrances attached to it? That we would take into account those encumbrances and say, okay, well, after that point in time, then yeah, you have to create a bright line for us.
So we have something else you're going to go back
Yes.
and work on. Good. All right.
There you go.
Is that it?
Thank you. I think that completes our presentation, and we came asking for feedback, and we got it. Thank you so much for that.
Very effective. Now, we would like to have, I think the next would be the public comment. Pardon? I'm sorry. I think that was very complete. I think we've had a robust, at least discussion, if not a robust audits. It'd be nice to hear public feedback, especially about some of the issues that our audit subcommittee is grappling with. So is there any public feedback or public comment? Any concerns? How do you think it's going? Any issues that you'd like to raise now that you've heard this discussion? And don't all jump up at once. There doesn't have to be a rush to the microphone. Well, I think we've done good work. We've identified the critical issues. We're sending them back to the mines to come back with work on these issues. If any of the members wish to make a final statement, we've done enough talking, I think, but I think our views have been expressed clearly in what we want to do, and I just want to thank everyone, OPSC for stepping up and being very supportive and working with the working group. I've only heard positive things about this. I think everybody realizes the importance of this venture. We just have some loose ends that really need to be completed. I think the general framework we're pretty clear on, how we're going to streamline this, how we're going to really have a much more transparent and open process. We're just not quite sure exactly what that means yet, and so we're going to hear back from that. And so without that, I think this committee is adjourned.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you.